Have you ever paused to consider the lives of the first humans, not as figures in a dusty book, but as living, breathing people? Have you ever read those staggering numbers in the early chapters of Genesis and wondered, why did they live so long? Adam, 930 years. Methuselah, 969 years. Noah, 950 years. These were not symbolic figures, they were lifespans. And if that was humanity's original design, a state of being where a single life could span nearly a millennium, then the most pressing question isn't why they lived so long, but why we don't. Why did it stop? The answer is not a simple tale of punishment. It is the story of a divine intervention, a cosmic emergency surgery performed by God to save humanity from itself, and to protect a sacred promise that was woven into the very fabric of time. The reason our lives are shorter is one of the most profound and overlooked keys to understanding God's entire plan of redemption, a plan that was calibrated down to the very last generation. Let's begin by stepping back into that primeval world, a world still echoing with the voice of its creator. Humanity was designed for longevity. This wasn't a glitch or an anomaly. It was the original operating system. When God formed man, he intended for a deep and lasting fellowship, a stewardship over the earth that required time, wisdom, and the transfer of knowledge. In that early world, there were no libraries, no printing presses, no internet. Wisdom was not stored in books, it was stored in people. Imagine the presence of Adam. For 930 years, he walked the earth. He was the living memory of humanity, the first-hand witness to Eden, to the fall, to the first promise of a Redeemer. He personally knew at least 8 generations of his descendants. Picture a young Lamech, the father of Noah, sitting at the feet of Adam, his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, hearing the story of creation not from a scroll, but from the man who was there, the knowledge of God, the history of their purpose, the warning of their failure. It was all transmitted directly, a living testimony passed down through the centuries from a single authoritative source. This was God's design, a chain of personal connection, an unbroken oral tradition that kept the truth of humanity's origin and purpose alive and vibrant. This incredible lifespan was a blessing, a tool meant to build a civilization founded on divine truth, with patriarchs serving as pillars of wisdom for entire epochs. But every great gift, when placed in the hands of a fallen nature, holds the potential to become a great danger. The very thing that was meant to be a blessing, this vast expanse of time, became a curse. Longevity, when mixed with the poison of sin, does not just extend life, it amplifies wickedness. It gives evil the one thing it needs most: time. Time to fester, to strategize, to build empires of corruption. A charismatic and malevolent leader in our time might influence a generation for 40 or 50 years, but in the antediluvian world, such a leader could wield influence for 500, 600, even 700 years. Imagine the depth of manipulation, the generations of followers indoctrinated into a twisted spirituality, the systems of oppression that could be built and perfected over centuries under a single, unwavering evil will. The knowledge that Adam passed down, the knowledge of God and the spiritual realm, could be perverted. Instead of fostering worship, it could be used to manipulate spiritual forces for power and control. The Bible describes this period in chilling terms in Genesis chapter 6, stating that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a permanent state of being, perfected and magnified by centuries of practice. The long lifespans had created a super incubation chamber for sin, allowing it to grow to monstrous proportions, threatening to permanently corrupt the human lineage and derail God's entire plan for redemption. The world was on a trajectory towards self-annihilation, and the very gift of a long life had become the fuel for its destruction. God had to intervene. And so we must ask, what does this perfected centuries-long evil actually look like? It's not merely an increase in the frequency of common sins. It's a qualitative shift in the very nature of rebellion. When you give a fallen being hundreds of years to study the fabric of creation, not to worship its creator but to exploit its mechanics for power, You don't just get more sophisticated criminals. You get a civilization that begins to actively dismantle the divine order. Humanity, armed with the living memory of Eden and the direct knowledge of the spiritual realm passed down from Adam, began to pry open doors they were never meant to touch. They took the sacred knowledge of the spiritual world and weaponized it. This is the dark context for one of the most mysterious and terrifying passages in all of Scripture. Right at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, it says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose." This wasn't romance, this was a hostile takeover. This was a deliberate, strategic corruption of the human bloodline at its source. The sons of God, powerful spiritual beings, saw the beauty of humanity, the imago Dei, the image of God, and instead of honoring it, they sought to possess and defile it. This was a spiritual invasion, a conspiracy to pollute the very wellspring from which the promised Redeemer, the seed of the woman, was prophesied to come. The long lifespans meant this wasn't an isolated incident or a brief affair. It was a sustained, systematic campaign of genetic and spiritual warfare against God's plan, spanning generations. And from this unholy union something monstrous was born. The Bible calls them the Nephilim. It says they were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. We often think of renown as a positive thing, but in this context it carries the chilling echo of fame born from terror, power, and violence. These were not simply giants. They were a biological and spiritual perversion, a grotesque fusion of the heavenly and the earthly. They were a living testament to humanity's ultimate rebellion, the attempt to hybridize themselves with divine power, to become gods on their own terms, seizing power rather than receiving it in worship. They were the walking, breathing embodiment of the world's corruption. Imagine a society where the ruling class, the most powerful warriors and leaders, were these semi-divine tyrants, beings born of a forbidden cosmic trespass. The very existence of the Nephilim was an abomination that twisted the created order. This is why the text says God saw that the wickedness of man was great. It wasn't just widespread, it was profound, reaching into the very code of what it meant to be human. The corruption was no longer just a matter of behavior. It was becoming a matter of biology. The lines were being blurred. The divine image was being systematically erased and overwritten with a demonic one. The project of humanity was on the verge of total, irreversible contamination. This wasn't a world that was just misbehaving. This was a world that was actively and successfully rewriting its own spiritual DNA. The long lifespans had given this dark project the time it needed to take root and flourish, to the point where the entire planet was being transformed into a stronghold for God's enemies. What could God do? The cancer was terminal. The entire organism of human civilization was consumed by it. A simple course correction was no longer possible. The very foundation had been corrupted, and the structure built upon it was an affront to heaven. It was in this context of profound grief, the grief of a creator watching his beloved creation mutilate itself, that God made the terrible and merciful decision to wash the world clean. The flood wasn't an act of a petulant, angry deity. It was the act of a divine surgeon cutting out a cancer that was about to kill the patient for good. It was an act of cosmic quarantine. But in the midst of this terminal diagnosis, the text gives us a sliver of hope, a single data point that stands in stark contrast to the rest of the world. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Why Noah? What was so different about this one man and his family? The Bible says Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations, and that he walked with God. We tend to read that word perfect and think it means he was sinless, that he never made a mistake. But the Hebrew word used here, distitupe, jektamim, has a much more specific and powerful meaning. It's the same word used to describe the animals for sacrifice in the Old Testament. It means unblemished, whole, without defect. It's a physical and genetic description as much as it is a moral one. In a world that was systematically corrupting its own DNA, a world where the human bloodline was being polluted by an angelic insurgency, Noah was called to Mo. His lineage was pure. He was fully, completely, and unreservedly human, just as the Creator had intended. This wasn't some kind of racial purity. This was about species integrity. It was about loyalty to the created order. Noah's family had, for 10 generations since Adam, refused to participate in the Great Rebellion. They had kept their line clean from the Nephilim corruption. His physical perfection was a direct result of his spiritual posture. Because he walked with God, he and his ancestors had not sought power and divinity through these forbidden unions. They had remained faithful to the Creator's design. So when God looked for a remnant, for a single untainted seed from which to restart the entire human project, he found it in Noah. He wasn't just the most righteous man on earth. He may have been one of the last genetically pure men on earth. And consider what it meant for him to walk with God in that specific society. The text also calls him a preacher of righteousness. For how long? We know he was 500 years old when his sons were born, and 600 when the flood came. This wasn't a weekend crusade. For decades, perhaps over a century, Noah was the lone voice of sanity in a world gone mad. Imagine his daily life. He is building a massive landlocked boat in his front yard, on a planet that had possibly never even seen rain before. He is warning his neighbors who are either terrified of or in league with, or perhaps even related to, the Nephilim tyrants who rule the land. He's preaching repentance to a culture that celebrated its own hybrid power. He's speaking of a holy, invisible God to a people who could literally see and interact with powerful, fallen sons of God. The Nephilim were the walking, breathing evidence that there was another way to gain power, a shortcut to becoming, quote, men of renown. Noah's message of humility, obedience, and faith must have seemed utterly ridiculous, a fool's errand. He was the village idiot on a cosmic scale, a man building a monument to a God nobody cared about anymore, warning of a judgment nobody believed was coming. Every single day, for years on end, he faced ridicule, scorn, and likely threats of violence from beings far more powerful than himself. His faith wasn't a comfortable, abstract belief. It was a rugged, daily act of defiance against the entire spirit of his age. It was the conviction that God's unseen word was more real than the monstrous reality he saw all around him. That conviction was absolutely essential, because the world Noah was trying to save was a world that had forgotten what it meant to be human. When Genesis chapter 6 says the earth was filled with violence, the Hebrew word used is Hamas. Now, in our modern world, that word has specific political connotations. But in its original context, it means something far deeper than just random crime or assault. Hamas is not a mugging in a dark alley. It is predatory violence, the kind of systemic, structural injustice that the powerful inflict upon the powerless. It is exploitation, oppression, and cruelty done with impunity. It's the violence of a society where might literally makes right. And who were the mighty? The Nephilim and their human allies. The men of renown. This wasn't a world with a high crime rate. It was a world organized around the principle of predatory power. The strong devoured the weak. The divinely infused hybrids ruled over the mere humans. The law of the jungle had become the law of civilization, amplified by supernatural power and intelligence. Imagine a caste system not based on birth or wealth, but on the percentage of angel DNA you carried in your veins. Imagine a world where justice was impossible, because the judges, the kings, and the warriors were all part of this corrupt hybrid aristocracy. That was the asterisk Hamas that filled the earth. It was a world bleeding from the inside out, a global system of oppression, with no recourse and no hope for appeal. But the problem was even deeper than that. The text says the earth was also corrupt. It says all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Again, we tend to think of this in purely moral terms, like lying or cheating. But the context, the presence of these unnatural unions, suggests something far more fundamental. The corruption was genetic. It was ontological. The very definition of flesh, of what it meant to be a human, an animal, a living creature, was being perverted. This wasn't just about fallen angels and human women. Once that boundary was broken, what other boundaries would stand? Ancient Jewish traditions, like the Book of Enoch and Jubilees, elaborate on this. They describe a world where this perverse interbreeding wasn't limited to humans. The fallen ones, in their rebellion, began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles. They were creating monstrous combinations, chimeric beings, that defied every category of the created order. They weren't just breaking God's laws, they were deconstructing God's creation, rewriting the source code of life itself. The corruption of all flesh was a biological and spiritual pandemic. The lines were blurring between species, between realms, between the natural and the monstrously unnatural. This is the world Noah inhabited. A place of systemic, brutal oppression. Hamas*, built on a foundation of fundamental, genetic corruption. It's why the judgment had to be so absolute. This wasn't a problem you could fix with a new political party or a religious revival. The contamination had gone down to the level of the DNA. The human genome itself, the vessel through which the promised seed of the woman from Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 was supposed to come, was at risk of being completely and irrevocably polluted. If the line of Adam became fully hybridized, there would be no pure human vessel through which the Messiah, the Redeemer, could one day be born. The entire plan of salvation would be thwarted before it could truly begin. So when God says, "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth," it sounds harsh, but we have to understand the context. He wasn't throwing a tantrum. He was a divine surgeon performing a radical, world-encompassing amputation to save the patient. The cancer of the Nephilim and the genetic chaos they had unleashed was terminal. It had spread to all flesh. To save humanity, God had to first cleanse the earth of what humanity was becoming. The flood wasn't just a punishment, it was an act of preservation. It was a terrible cosmic reset, necessary to protect the promise of redemption. It was the only way to ensure that a pure-blooded, fully human family, Tamim, would survive to carry the seed of hope into the new world. And let's drill down on that description of Noah. The text says he was perfect in his generations. The Hebrew word there is kamim, duf. This word is incredibly important. It doesn't just mean morally perfect, like he never made a mistake. It means complete, whole, sound, unblemished. It's the same word used to describe the animals required for sacrifice in the law of Moses. The lamb brought to the altar had to be tamim, without spot, without defect, physically whole. It wasn't about the lamb's moral character. It was about its physical integrity. When the Bible applies this word to Noah's generations, it's telling us something profound about his genealogy. In a world where the human gene pool was being systematically corrupted, hijacked by a foreign intelligence, Noah and his family were unblemished. His lineage was pure. He was 100% Adamic. This is why his righteousness and his genetic purity are mentioned in the same breath. His spiritual integrity, a righteous man, was inseparable from his physical integrity, tamim in his generations. He walked with God in a world that was literally dehumanizing itself, a world that was chasing a monstrous, transhumanist future. Noah's refusal to participate in this corruption, his simple faithfulness to God and to his own created nature, made him the vessel of salvation for the entire human race. He was the genetic bottleneck through which the pure line of Adam had to pass to preserve the promise of Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. And we have to be clear about who the perpetrators were. The sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim. For centuries, people have tried to water this down, to explain it away. The most common attempt is the Sethite view, that the sons of God were the righteous descendants of Adam's son Seth, and the daughters of men were the ungodly descendants of Cain. A simple story of good boys marrying bad girls. But you have to ask yourself, does that interpretation have enough explanatory power to justify what comes next? Does the marriage of two different human lineages, however spiritually mismatched, result in superhuman giants known as the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown? Does it lead to a corruption of all flesh, including animals? Does it warrant a judgment so severe that the entire planet must be wiped clean and started anew? The punishment seems wildly disproportionate to that particular crime. The text demands a more direct and frankly more terrifying reading. The ancient world, and the New Testament writers themselves, understood exactly who these beings were. The Apostle Peter speaks of the angels who sinned, whom God cast into hell, and kumi chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. He specifically places this event in the context of the flood, saying God did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah. The book of Jude is even more explicit, speaking of the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode. They committed gross immorality and went after strange flesh. The Greek term there is sarkos heteros, literally, a different kind of flesh. This was a cosmic transgression, a violation of dimensional boundaries. These were divine beings, angelic watchers, who abandoned their posts and illegally inserted themselves into the physical, biological reality of Earth to sabotage God's creation from the inside out. But this raises a chilling question. If the flood was the answer, the great cleansing, did it solve the problem for good? Look closely at Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 again. It's one of the most haunting verses in the entire Bible. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. There it is. A little parenthetical statement dropped in like a time bomb. And also afterward. The flood was a reset. It wiped the slate clean. But it seems the incursion wasn't a one-time event. The spiritual entities behind this were not destroyed in the floodwaters. And the temptation to breach the barriers between worlds didn't go away. The problem came back. This single phrase, and also afterward, recontextualizes so much of what happens in the rest of the Old Testament. When the Israelite spies are sent into the land of Canaan hundreds of years later, what do they report? And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. The giants were back, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zuzim. The Old Testament lists multiple clans of them. Og, king of Bashan, had a bed that was 13 feet long. Goliath was over 9 feet tall. Where did these post-flood giants come from? The text implies it was a second, smaller-scale incursion. The enemy tried the same tactic again. And this sheds a terrifying new light on God's command to Israel to show no mercy to the Canaanite tribes, to utterly destroy them, men, women, and children. From our modern perspective, it sounds like genocide. But what if it wasn't just a war against a culture or a people? What if it was a continuation of this ancient war against a corrupted bloodline? What if it was another necessary, localized act of surgical cleansing to prevent the Nephilim gene pool from spreading and contaminating the line of promise once again? The war to protect the seed of the woman continued long after the waters of the flood had receded. This wasn't just a territorial dispute. This was a battle for the timeline of human redemption. Remember the very first prophecy in the Bible, Genesis chapter 3 verse 15? God speaks to the serpent after the fall in the garden. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. From that moment, the entire drama of history revolves around this conflict of two seeds, two bloodlines. The seed of the woman, the lineage that would ultimately produce the Messiah, and the seed of the serpent. The enemy, that ancient serpent, understood this. His primary strategy, from the very beginning, was to corrupt, co-opt, or cut off the line of the woman's seed. The Nephilim Project was his most audacious, most direct attempt to do just that. If you can contaminate all human DNA with an angelic, demonic element, you can prevent a pure human savior from ever being born. The flood was God's response to checkmate that move. But the post-flood incursion shows the enemy's persistence. And notice the strategy. It's far more targeted this time. The giants aren't spread across the whole earth. They are concentrated in very specific, strategic locations. Where? Primarily in the land of Canaan. The very land God had promised to Abraham and his descendants. It's no coincidence. The enemy was setting up beachheads, creating demonic strongholds, and populating the promised land with these terrifying super soldiers to prevent Israel from ever taking it. He was trying to squat on the very stage where the story of redemption was meant to unfold. Think about the geography. The Book of Enoch, an ancient, non-canonical text but one that gives us insight into the thinking of that time, says the Watchers descended on Mount Hermon. Where is Mount Hermon? It sits on the northern border of ancient Israel, overlooking the region of Bashan. And who was the king of Bashan? Og. The Bible makes a special point to tell us in Deuteronomy chapter 3 That Og was the last of the remnant of the Rephaim, the giants. The enemy literally set up a giant king's fortress right at the doorstep of the Promised Land, near the very place tradition says the original corruption began. This is spiritual warfare with geographical coordinates. This is the context for the spies' report in the book of Numbers. 10 of the 12 spies come back terrified, saying, "The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height." They saw the sons of Anak, the Nephilim. Their terror wasn't just cowardice, it was a reaction to the supernatural reality on the ground. They saw the enemy's checkmate move and believed it was unstoppable. Only Joshua and Caleb had the faith to see past the giants and focus on the God who was bigger. They understood that this wasn't just about real estate, it was about God's promise, the promise of the seed. And this reframes the most famous giant-slaying story of all. David versus Goliath. This is not just a children's story about a brave boy and a big bully. This is a pivotal skirmish in this ancient cosmic war. Who was Goliath? He was from Gath, one of the last 3 cities where the Anakim had survived after Joshua's initial conquest. He was a remnant, a holdover from that Nephilim bloodline. And listen to his challenge. He doesn't just mock Israel's army, he defies the armies of the living God. This is a spiritual challenge. He is the champion of the serpent's seed, standing against the people of the promised seed. And who does God raise up? A young shepherd boy named David, not a soldier but a king in waiting. The one from whose line the Messiah, the ultimate seed of the woman, would come. When David picks up those 5 smooth stones, he isn't just preparing for a physical fight, he is stepping onto the battlefield of the ages. His victory wasn't just a military triumph, it was a prophetic declaration that the line of promise would not be broken, that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head, no matter how monstrous or terrifying a form it took. Every giant that fell in the Old Testament was another battle won in the long, bloody war to keep the human bloodline pure for the coming of the king. The command to cleanse the land wasn't about racial purity, it was about redemptive purity. It was a divine quarantine to protect the future of all humanity. And it's crucial to understand that Goliath wasn't just a biological anomaly. Look at the detailed description of his armor and weaponry in 1 Samuel chapter 17. A coat of mail weighing 5,000 shekels of bronze, a spear with an iron head of 600 shekels. This is advanced, almost hyper-advanced military technology for that period. It's a manifestation of that forbidden knowledge whispered about in the ancient texts. The knowledge of war and metalworking brought by the fallen watchers. Goliath is the embodiment of the serpent's kingdom, a being of corrupt genetics, armed with corrupt technology, animated by a spirit of rebellion against the living God. So when David steps onto that field with a shepherd's staff and 5 smooth stones, simple, earthen, organic tools, it represents a fundamental clash between 2 completely different systems. It's the economy of faith versus the economy of monstrous pride. It's the humility of God's chosen shepherd against the armored arrogance of the serpent's champion. David's victory wasn't just about good aim. It was a divine declaration that all the corrupted power and technological might of the rebellion is nothing before a single faithful servant of the Most High. This war against the remnant seed continued throughout David's entire reign. It wasn't a one-and-done event. If you read 2 Samuel chapter 21, it feels like a final mopping up operation. The text specifically lists 4 more giants, all of whom were descendants of the Rapha in Gath. There was Ishbi-benob, who wore new armor and whose bronze spear was so massive that he nearly killed King David himself before Abishai, David's nephew, intervened and struck the giant down. There was Saph, another descendant. Then there was Lahmi, the brother of Goliath, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. And finally, there was an unnamed giant of great stature who was a genetic horror, born with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. The text is meticulous in pointing out that these were not just random tall Philistines. They were the last vestiges of that specific cursed bloodline. David and his mighty men were engaged in a targeted campaign to finish the work Joshua had started, to systematically eradicate the last physical strongholds of the Nephilim seed from the Promised Land, thereby securing both the territory and the genetic line through which the Messiah would come. So, with the last of the physical giants gone, does the war end? Not at all. The enemy's strategy simply evolves. Having failed to stop the seed by corrupting the human gene pool, the focus of the assault shifts from the physical to the purely spiritual and ideological. The battle moves from the plains of Canaan to the hearts and minds of humanity. And this is where the ministry of Jesus Christ becomes a masterclass in spiritual warfare, and it happens on the exact same geography. Consider where Jesus chooses to make one of his most pivotal declarations. Matthew chapter 16 tells us he took his disciples to the region of Caesarea Philippi. For the casual reader, this is just a dot on a map. But for anyone who understands the cosmic geography of the Old Testament, this is a five-alarm fire. Caesarea Philippi is situated at the very base of Mount Hermon. This is the traditional site of the descent of the Watchers, the location of their blasphemous oath. This was, for all intents and purposes, ground zero of the Nephilim corruption. Not only that, this entire region was the ancient kingdom of Bashan, the kingdom ruled by Og, the last of the giant kings. The Bible even calls it the land of the Rephaim. In Jesus' time, the area was a major center of pagan worship, specifically dedicated to the god Pan. Right there at Caesarea, Philippi was a grotto, a cave, which was known throughout the Roman world as the Gates of Hades, or the Gates of Hell. It was believed to be a literal portal to the underworld, a place where the spiritual realm bled into the physical. So Jesus, the promised seed of the woman, deliberately leads his disciples to the enemy's ancient headquarters. He takes them to the foot of the mountain of rebellion, to the capital of the last giant king, and stands them before the very gates of hell. And it is in that place, saturated with millennia of demonic history, that he asks the question, "Who do you say that I am?" When Peter gives the correct, divinely inspired answer, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," Jesus responds with a declaration of war. He says, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." Understand the military language here. Gates are a defensive structure. A city's gates don't attack you. You attack the gates. Jesus is not saying his church will be a fortress to hide in while hell assaults it. He is announcing that his church, his ecclesia, his called out ones, will be the invading army. We are the ones laying siege to the strongholds of darkness. He is declaring that the enemy's defenses, the very gates of their underworld kingdom, will crumble before the advance of his people. He is launching the great counteroffensive right from the enemy's primary command and control center. He's not just saving individuals. He is reclaiming territory, both spiritual and physical, that had been under enemy occupation since the fall in Eden and the corruption at Hermon. So let me leave you with this question to wrestle with. How does understanding the church as an offensive army, actively storming the gates of hell, change the way you view your own personal mission and daily battles? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. If this perspective has fired you up, do me a favor and subscribe, and be sure to hit that notification bell, because in our next video, we're going to unpack the specific spiritual authority Jesus gives us to tear down these strongholds. You won't want to miss it. Until then, stay on the offensive. This is Marco.